Welcome to YO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Cintia Martínez Velasco, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of Oregon. Her research and teaching interests include feminist philosophy, gender theory, decolonial philosophy, and critical theory in Latin America. Martínez Velasco was a 2019-2020 Andrew W. Melan Postdoctoral Fellow in Latin American Critical Theory at Northwestern University. She earned her Ph.D. in philosophy from the National Autonomous University of Mexico in 2019, where she taught philosophy from 2018 to 2022. Professor Martínez Velasco joined the UO faculty in fall of 22. Thanks so much for coming on the show, and welcome belatedly to the University of Oregon.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation and for your interest in my work.
I'm always interested in interesting work, and your work is immensely interesting. So let's start. Tell us about your background, where you're from, and what sparked your interest in philosophy. How did you come to be a philosopher?
Yeah, well, I studied all my career in Mexico City. Well, yes, mainly in Mexico City. And my first interest when I was a teenager was science. I studied chemistry, and also I used to dance, modern dance and ballet. So while I was doing research in chemistry, I was studying that career, I started to read Kuhn. And I remember that this idea that all my beliefs and all my deep thoughts in science could be framed in other, or could be the result of other circumstances than the scientific truth. That was the reason why I started to read philosophy again, to start to be interested in philosophy. And I remember that I used to just let the experiments in the lab and escape for taking classes in the philosophy department. So I finally decided to quit that career and start with philosophy.
So you studied with Enrique Dusel.
Yeah.
So a revered philosopher, a Latin American philosopher, revered. I mean, I was just looking at his publication record. It's insane. Passed away, I think, 2023.
Yes, some months ago. It was so sad.
So tell us about him and how his work has influenced yours.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, he died recently. It was extremely sad. Fortunately, I was in Mexico. Yes, I worked with him for 12 years, all my career, since I was studying the bachelor degree. And in total, those were 12 years, because in Mexico we write 3 dissertations, after the bachelor and after the master's, and he was my mentor in the master's and the Ph.D. And what I can say, one of the main things he taught me first was to defend my interest in feminism, because feminism was not that relevant. It was not important in 2017 that I was struggling with my PhD dissertation. So I remember his support. He was very proud of my work, or my interest in doing something new. And also, for me, it was really important how he defended his right to be a thinker from Latin America. Yeah. So he was so brave doing that, and it was inspiring to me. And I thought, well, if that person is so secure about himself as a thinker, why I couldn't be? I mean, I'm a woman. I know this is going to be harder, but I can follow his steps. So, and also, I will publish response, a little critique to his work, like in a couple of months. But I follow his interest in thinking in the oppressed. In philosophy of liberation is based on oppression. So, in that way, I follow his steps, but thinking in feminism.
So, you've already made it clear that feminist philosophy is crucial to what you do.
Yes.
And that you are also a decolonial philosopher.
Yes.
So tell me, what are some of the benefits of bringing together feminist philosophy and decolonial philosophy? Why is that a good thing to do?
Yeah, I think that like what we are living in the global south that is happening in the new feminist movement is like the vanguard of political activity, in my opinion. So what is happening, what it started on the streets is like increasing in relevance, and it is changing the common sense we have through gender and social relationships. So what started with Ni Una Menos or Ni Una Más in South America, then it was repeated in United States with other movements against sexual harassment, and then it started to be like an issue not only to think about sexual harassment, but also the place that the woman labor in capitalism is also relevant to understand that the work of taking care of other people and all the work that is not considered like relevant for the classic Marxism, who think about this worker who go to the factory. Then instead of that, we are thinking about other types of work that are more performed by women. And then I think that is changing the way we understand many things, like social relationships, but also work, but also the organization of work, but also the relevance that we give to some things that are done by women. No? So in that sense, I think that to look what is like happening when feminist philosophers, decolonial philosophers are putting in the center, such as the debt, the reproduction theory, or the violence is very relevant for understanding, like in general, not only in the colonial terms, but in general for understanding Western civilization. You know?
So you mentioned violence and women, and one of the areas that you focus on is femicide in Latin America and especially in Mexico. So first of all, what is femicide, and why is this a crime that's rampant in Latin America, in particular in Mexico? And also, what drew you to that topic, that problem, as a philosopher?
Thank you. Well, yes, I do. Well, first, feminicidio. I like to use the word in Spanish because I think it's untranslatable. Like, there are like many connotations that were given by feminist activists in Latin America that give a specific meaning to that word in Spanish, but I'm writing about that. But feminicidio, it's to kill a woman because of gender reasons. And then it is typified in the penal code in Mexico. The typification started in 2012, and it is considered feminicidio every death that has some of the following characteristics. For example, if the victim suffers sexual violence, then it's considered feminicidio. If the victim had a relationship with the killer, then it's considered feminicidio. If it was, I don't know, friendship or another type of relationship, it's enough to consider this feminicidio. If the victim was incommunicated, it's considered feminicidio. And also an element that is very important for what I'm doing now is that if the victim's body appears publicly exhibited in a degrading way, then it is considered feminicidio. So now the National Observatory on Feminicidio in Mexico said that the last 3 years we had 70,500 feminicidios in Mexico, which of course the numbers are very different to the numbers given by the government. So my work is, of course, to push the recognition, first to think about the homologation of the crime, because it's not this, there is a penal code ruling the country, but every state like takes whatever they want of this typification and then do whatever they want with the crimes. So the first thing is to push the homologation. The second is to talk about transfeminicidio, of course, because recently a big amount of transgender women have been killed. And it is important to distinguish that there are other elements that involve, because here the context is very important to recognize feminicidio. So transfeminicidio involves new or different elements, but similar in some ways. So it's important to distinguish that. I'm pushing for that. But my main interest through, or why I think that philosophy is important here, is to talk about femi-genocide, which includes to consider that feminicidio is a genocide or a type of genocide. And their philosophy is relevant because it's important for distinguishing what is considered a woman. That's a philosophical question, no? The ontology of gender here is very relevant. And because in the Estatuto de Rome, I don't know how to translate that, Rome.
Law that comes from the Vatican.
Yeah, thank you. Gender is not element considered for genocide. You can talk about ethnic groups, religious groups, national groups, but no gender. So what I'm working in is in, of course, giving broad idea of womanhood, which could include trans women, a material idea or a material ontology there involved in womanhood that could like also embrace transgender women. But also I am thinking in, there is another problem for considering feminicidio genocide, because it's important to prove the intent to destroy that group. So it means it's necessary to change the common sense for doing that, because most of the time the response we have in cases in tribunals is that it's a personal intention, but not an impersonal intention interested in destroying one person, but no, in destroying the gender of that person. But at the same time, feminicide involves the gender, or that is the reason of the murder. So that's also a philosophical problem. So I'm trying to give like a strong solution for that. I'm working on that. That's not easy.
Yeah, I mean, so it turns out that you've recently returned from Mexico, where you were working at the invitation of the new feminist Foreign Affairs Embassy.
Yes.
So you're not just the philosopher, you're trying to, as you say, you're not just trying to theorize this, you're trying to take action in the world. So tell us about the work that you did when you were in Mexico with the new feminist Foreign Affairs Embassy. And what were some of the challenges of that work?
Yeah, thank you. I received this invitation recently. I was really flattered because it was the inaugural keynote for this big event that was interested in talking against the violence against women and girls. And then, like, it was an event with ambassadors, but also activists, with also experts in that topic, the topic of violence. What was very nice was the opportunity for me to first meet with some friends who are more active. Like, thank you for thinking of me as an activist. I don't consider myself an activist. I would love to be, but it requires like strength and courage, and to be courageous. And yeah, like I deeply admire like activists in Mexico, feminist activists in Mexico. But I met some of them, and then I tried to recover like the concerns, and I tried to present them in the clearest way possible in front of this audience. And what I tried to do was to push the things I mentioned, transfeminicidio, homologation of the crime, but also I presented this idea of femi-genocide, which was absolutely difficult because in some sense, this idea of femigenocide, it's saying that the impunity of the crime is related with the state, or in some sense, the state is responsible for that deaths. Because feminicidio can occur, but if it occurs 17,500 times in 3 years, it's because there is a state that is like letting this happening, and in that sense, it's more a political problem, of course, than only a domestic problem. So I was a little bit worried about the response, and it was amazing because some of the ambassadors there were working with migration. So what I'm saying with genocide is that, or why I include the term genocide, is to push or to support the idea that the current war we are living in Latin America, and also all the organized crime that lets, or it's linked to feminicidio. And then it is necessary to explore that context of war we are living in for the modification of the penal code, or the modification of the typification we have now, because there are some elements that are not like useful entirely for counting correctly. No, for example, in the thing that I presented this in November, I was mentioning that in case of sexual slavery, if there is sexual slavery, then it should be considered immediately feminicidio the case, no? And then that means that we are like aware about how organized crime is behind this. So that should be part of the typification, and that should be like for every state, and not also for every state. What I did like about this international event we had, because this event was broadcasted in 30 countries in the world, is that we need to share that information with other countries in Latin America, but also in Africa, but also in the world. It's important to homologate in the world. That's my dream. No, but yeah, like those cases should be included, and it should like be considered this like political problem that is sensitive to what we are living now in Latin America, or the amount of violence we live. And the translation would be like fair with the cases we have. So I work with that, and then I like the response, especially from the people who worked with migration, was great, because they said, oh, that thing that you are mentioning will be helpful for understanding the case of women who are migrating, because most of the time feminicide is only like the way we have it typified is useful for specific women, but not the women that are like in transit, or they are moving from other countries. So I guess that this is the beginning of something that could be enriched, and then could be like, I don't know, I would like to hear from other fellows and colleagues in other countries, and to work together with that, or keep on working with that problem.
Yeah. So, I mean, philosophers are often caricatured as being more concerned with theory than with practice, with thinking than with acting. Now, you're being modest to say that you're not an activist, but it's fair to say that as a philosopher, you are a philosopher who is interested in the political agency or impact of philosophy. You believe that philosophy can be useful to address political problems. So why? Why do you think that's the case? Why don't you just think that what philosophers are supposed to do is sit in their offices and think? Why do you think that it's important for your ideas to have agency in the world of politics and praxis?
In some way, because I'm Enrique Dusel's student, so this idea of organic intellectual, it's very strong in Latin America. No, it's very Marxist, but also because I'm very Marxist in that sense, and following Marx's thesis on Feuerbach, its philosophy should be about changing the world. But what the meaning of that to me is not to get rid of theory, because like I have been in contact with activists who say, no, that's wasting of time. I shouldn't, like, why it would be useful to spend hours reading. And then I think philosophy should be interested in changing the world and in selecting what is relevant to think for changing the world. And in that sense, for me, it's more a service than something relevant to my ego. No? It's more a service. How can I be useful as a person for improving the situation we are living in? And then I try to be on streets. I try to do this as much as I can because I'm a very nervous person, so I'm like, I'm not that brave, no, but I try to be as much as I can and then pay attention to what is relevant to, like, think. You know? And I hope I'm doing something, but yeah.
Well, so, I mean, the agency of academics is various. And one of the things that you do is you're a board member of the International Association of Women Philosophers, for which you organized the symposium Feminisms Today at the University of Buenos Aires this past summer. So tell us about that organization, what does it do, and about that symposium.
Thank you. Yes, I'm very happy with that event. That's an organization founded by Germans. And then I started to be a board member since 2018, which was great because I was, I don't know, 35 years old or something like that. And I was interested in take the eyes of a group of feminist philosophers from all over the world to what is happening in Latin America. So we organized this event in Argentina, which was absolutely amazing because like we could meet, respect each other as thinkers, which for me is very important. Actually, I'm active in the parallel organization in Mexico. We have a red, the Filósofas Mexicanas, the network of Mexican philosophers, women philosophers. And what is very relevant about those spaces is that we take us seriously. It's very difficult to be a philosopher in Latin America because it's a discipline, a masculine discipline everywhere. But in Latin America, it's really heavy and difficult to have the opportunity of believing your own words. So that's why we work in. And in Argentina was nice because we had like people from all the world, and like especially from Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Argentina, and then like hundreds of young and not that young philosophers were there, like paying attention to each other and I don't know, find colleagues and friendship there. You know?
Yeah, very important. So I mentioned in the introduction that you were an Andrew Melan Fellow at Northwestern University.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about what you were doing while you were there.
Yeah, well, I was invited. I was giving a talk in Mexico, and then this woman comes to me and say, "Hey, yeah, I'm interested in what you said. You were great." And then I was like, "Thank you." She sent me her. No, she gave me her email, and she was Penelope Deutscher, the woman, the philosopher who coordinates that project. And I was just surprised when I realized who invited me to Northwestern. I didn't know what was Northwestern, I'm sorry. But I say yes. And then I was there. What we did was really nice. I worked with Jose Medina, he's amazing. All of them were, Natalie Busaglo and Alejandra Oslenghi and all the students, and we organized some workshops for working on syllabus in decolonial, queer theory, and feminist theory with people from different countries in America and Latin America, North America and Latin America. So it was very nice. I learned a lot. And also we translated Santiago Castro Gomez's book, The Critic of Latin American Reason. So we did a translation and a panel on that, where like young scholars gave him like responses to that book. Of course, that book was written many years ago, but then like it was a way of taking the book seriously and reading the book in English, which was great.
So you mentioned that when you were there, you worked with students, and you are obviously here at the University of Oregon, in addition to being a scholar and some kind of an activist. You are also a teacher.
Yes.
So what do you teach in this term? Tell us about your teaching.
Well, right now I'm teaching the Introduction to Latin American Philosophy, which is very nice. I like it. There I'm teaching like the canon, but also feminist Latin American philosophy, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So I teach like Enrique Dusel, Mariette. Well, the problem of Latin America's otherness, or the problem of thinking Latin America through genealogy, or thinking in Latin America as a way, an experience of different eras of modernity. Mm-hmm. That's something that we discussed there. Or thinking about the Marxist examples of Latin American philosophy we have, thinking in the subject of history instead of the proletarian. We think in indigenous people as this subject of history, but also I'm thinking in mourning and disappearance during dictatorships, but also in the recent wars. And also I think about, in that class I am teaching about Zapatismo and those like new, well not that new, like those anarchist organizations against government. Yes, I teach about that. And also I'm teaching critical theory right now, which is, my class right now is very classical. The first generation of Frankfurt School, so it's a little bit dark and pessimistic, but yeah, it's like the negative interpretation or the negative way of understanding enlightenment, which is, I think, useful for being critical, thinking in terms of capitalism. And also I'm trying to take that class for thinking in the current fascism we are living now in different countries. So that will be the end of the course.
When you say the canon of Latin American philosophy, are there any women in the canon of Latin American philosophy?
Well, in my opinion, yes, and I take them. Maria Lugones is part of that canon, Ofelia Schutt is part of that canon, of course Linda Alcoff is part of that canon. It's important to mention that I studied in Latin America and I never read woman as part of that canon. So when I came here, I realized and I integrated that. But also my syllabus is taught, also I include queer decoloniality in some part of it. So my syllabus is taught like 40% men and the other, like, the new voices I want to read and explore. Yeah.
That sounds like the right
to be honest.
So we're almost out of time, so this will be my last question. So you're a philosopher of Latin America, a decolonial philosopher. You are from Mexico, but here you are at the University of Oregon.
Yes.
So what attracted you to the University of Oregon?
Yeah, well, I remember I was searching for a job. And then I opened this page that Penelope Doce recommended to check field jobs, and then the first thing that appeared was this university, and I just searched for it. And then I look at the students and the work they were doing, and then I was like thinking, is this possible in the philosophy department? I mean, like, they are working on race and gender and environmental issues, and then the queers here, why? Where do they come from? Marxists here, all mixed, and then I studied, they review the professor, and then I was thinking, that guy is from Chile, and that guy is, from Mexico, and then what is happening in that department? So I applied for the first time. I said, well, I will try, and then I got the job, yes.
Yes, the philosophy department at the University of Oregon is an amazing group of people.
Yes, it is. Yes, I am not very familiar with the academy here, but I was lucky enough to just select the perfect place in me.
And we were lucky enough to
Thank you.
manage to get you here. So, Cynthia, thanks so much for talking with us today. It's been really a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
I've been speaking with Cintia Martínez Velasco, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of Oregon. Thanks so much for watching.